Hello and welcome to the Best Practices in TestRail User Administration webinar. I'm the TestRail Product Manager, Simon Knight, and also with me on the webinar today is Jacob Scott, one of our TestRail support engineers, who you'll also recognize from many of our previous How to Use TestRail webinars. I've got a few housekeeping announcements before we get started. We're planning on around about 45 minutes for the webinar, give or take. We'll be using the GoToWebinar chat console to take questions during the webinar, as usual. If you have any questions related to using TestRail and specifically related to the content that we're going to be covering today, which is mainly geared towards user administration, then you can ask them using the GoToWebinar console. And we will try to answer them directly in the console. So Jacob is going to be fielding those whilst I'm talking through the various bits and pieces of content that we're going to demonstrate today. Also, if we have time at the end of the webinar, then we will try to answer some of your questions there as well. We will be keeping everybody on mute throughout the entire webinar, but like I say, if you do have questions, please do feel free to share them in the GoToWebinar chat room. We're also recording the webinar, and so long as you've registered for it using your own email address, then shortly after the webinar, once the video has been processed, we will send you out a link to the recording. Okay, so during the webinar, we're going to be talking about how best to administrate your users in TestRail. Specifically, we're going to cover off the management of user permissions, user roles and groups in the user administration areas, and how to manage your TestRail sessions so as to keep your testing and all of your related product information that you've stored inside a TestRail secure. We're also going to touch on how we've implemented GDPR compliance in TestRail. And once we've done that, we'll move on to a couple of other administration features that are more geared towards enterprise organizations that we introduced in our recent 5.7 TestRail release. All right, so without further ado, let's get into our first topic, managing groups and roles and permissions inside of TestRail. So TestRail's permissions and role systems allow you to configure and restrict the project access and the permissions for your individual users and for any groups that you might want to assign or create for them inside of TestRail. So all of our TestRail user roles, groups, and permission settings are found in the administration area under users and roles, as you can see here. And as you can also see, TestRail comes with some predefined roles straight out of the box. And all of those roles can be customized or extended as you need. And also you can create your own new roles if you need them. So you can use the out of the box roles that I'm demonstrating here, or you can create entirely new ones. It's entirely up to you. In TestRail, roles are collections of permissions that can be assigned to users. So you can see the permissions here. Those can be assigned to users either globally in the administration console or on a per project basis, depending on if you want to restrict access to some of your projects to certain users within your TestRail instance. The built-in roles each have their own set of permissions, corresponding to the expected use and name of the role. So again, you could just use all of our built-in roles straight out of the box without any further configuration. You can just go and take a look at those roles, see what permissions they have, and use them accordingly. Or you can change the permissions and the role names if you wish. You can also use groups on a per project basis to manage groups of users rather than individual ones. So you should note that there always needs to be a default role in TestRail, and that's so that there's a role to fall back to in case you delete roles that are still in use. The default role is also the one that is assigned to new users when they are added to TestRail. So be sure to choose your default role wisely. And one very good reason to split out your testing into different projects is so that you can restrict access to your testing assets to only the people that need them. You can define user access at the level of your projects by going to your project administration page and selecting the Access tab. Once you're on the Project Access tab, you can either specify the default access for the project in the Default Access drop-down, as I've demonstrated there, or you can assign access controls to individuals and groups. By way of an example, if you wanted your project to be ultra secure, then you could set the default access for the project to be no access. Now, the only way another user will have access to the project is if you explicitly grant them access, either individually using the individual project access drop-down, or as part of a group by using the group project access drop-down. Just as an aside, if a user doesn't have access to a project, then unless they're an administrator, they won't be able to see it either. So the combination of global roles, default project access, and user and group specific access to projects makes TestRail's roles and permission system very flexible and powerful. In TestRail 5.7, we also added a new modify test results feature to further extend the available permissions and fulfill a couple of highly requested features from within our TestRail community. In a nutshell, we enhanced the result status functionality so that if you make a mistake or for some reason enter a test result status that you later decide needs to be changed, you can now do so. Prior to 5.7, you would not have been able to change the result status, and you'd have needed to enter a new result with the status that you wanted to record. And for some people that was a problem because it obviously affects your reporting and stuff like that. We also added a new modify test results permission. So that's turned off by default, but once you enable it, then users with the modify results permission have the ability to modify the results of other testers should they need it for review purposes, for example. Now, since the modify test results permission allows users to edit existing test results, we strongly recommend that you only provide it to users who really need it. It could be dangerous in the wrong hands. That's why it's disabled by default. So we recommend that you only give it to lead testers, test managers, people that that you trust and want to empower to be able to go in and make minor changes to your test results should they absolutely need to. One of the ways in which this functionality benefits testers, though, over and above the ability to be able to make corrections or adjustments where needed, is that if you have tests that span a period of time, so long-running business acceptance tests, for example, that take a couple of days to execute, and as a result, you have situations where more than one person is involved in executing the test, then enabling that modified test result will allow for situations where you can have one person starting off a test and then another person coming in and finishing that test off at a later date, if for some reason the original tester isn't available to do so. One additional thing to be aware of is that the modified test result functionality does honor the pre-existing editing test results setting in the administration console. So if you want to time restrict or extend the modified test result functionality to a certain window of time, that's where you can do it. Okay, so while we're on the subject of managing your users, there's a few other useful features that I want to touch on. Managing your user licenses, GDPR, and session management inside of TestRail. So if you want to see which of your users are actively using their TestRail license, then you can take a look at the users tab in the administration area and you can see when the last time they actually logged into TestRail was. If they haven't logged in for a while, or if they've never logged in at all, then the user is probably a good candidate for setting to inactive rather than active. Why would you want to do that? Well, setting users to inactive means that they don't count towards your TestRail billing for a start. So it's probably something that you would want to keep on top of. If you have a number of users you need to update, then you can use the bulk edit feature to do them all at once, rather than working through each one individually. So you can see here that I'm just about to make some bulk edits, changing them all to inactive and then applying those changes. So just in terms of the last active timestamp still, we don't monitor the last active timestamp for billing purposes. We only monitor whether or not the user is marked as active or inactive during the billing period in question. But obviously staying on top of the last login times of your users and setting them to active or inactive based on their usage is going to be a good way of making sure that you stay on top of your TestRail billing. Okay, so while I've been demonstrating the user functionality, you might have noticed a couple of funny looking usernames in the lists of users. So there we go. No, that's not one of them. Let's just go find one of those. Actually, I'm just going to forget this user. Okay, so this is how we handle GDPR requests to forget user details inside of TestRail. Because of the EU General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, TestRail administrators need a mechanism in TestRail that enables them to effectively wipe out or forget a user's personally identifying information from the TestRail database. Since in this case the personally identifying information is the user's name and email address, we introduced the forget user feature way back in TestRail 5.5 actually, to ensure that administrators can remove usernames from TestRail quickly and easily should they need to do so. To use the forget user feature as I'm demonstrating here, all you need to do is go into the subject user's profile and click the forget user link as an administrator, obviously. Once you've confirmed you definitely want to proceed, the user's name and email address will be obfuscated and the user will be marked as inactive. You might reasonably ask why we chose to obfuscate the user instead of just removing them completely. And the simple answer is that that user, if they've been using TestRail for any length of time, then they're going to be linked to a number of assets inside of TestRail. So they may have created test cases, test runs, they may have executed tests, provided results and comments and assignments and the like. So in order to preserve the integrity of all of those things, we still need a username of some sort attached to them. So in this case, an obfuscated username. And as I mentioned, the user is set to inactive as well. So the other thing you might want to consider implementing if you want an additional layer of security around the testing and the product information inside of your TestRail instance is session management. Using session management to secure your TestRail user sessions is basically going to help prevent folk from just hijacking one of your users' browser sessions if they happen to walk away from an unlocked PC for a period of time, for example. It's the same kind of thing you see with banking sites where if you leave your web session open for a couple of minutes without any activity, they'll ask you if you're still there and log you out if you don't provide an appropriate response. So we provide you with a few options in this regard, depending on what level of session security you want to implement. If you just want to make sure that users have to re-log in each time they open a new TestRail browser session, you can simply disable the Remember Me checkbox without taking any further actions. If you want users to get logged out after a period of inactivity, you can enable the idle session timeout with either a pre-configured value, 30 minutes for example, or something like that, or you can set your own custom timeout value. If you want to set a hard timeout that forces your users to re-log into TestRail every day or once a week, for example, then you can do that by using the absolute session timeout policy settings, as I've demonstrated here. Okay, so moving on to single sign-on. Single sign-on was super high up on our list of requested features, particularly by enterprise organizations. Teams with large numbers of users needing to be managed in some kind of federated fashion. We added that as a feature to TestRail in 5.7. With TestRail single sign-on, you can integrate TestRail with your identity provider of choice and manage all of your users centrally, making life easier for you, the administrator, and for your users, since they now only need to log in once and have access to all of their enterprise applications, including TestRail. So here's an example I set up earlier in true Blue Peter style, demonstrating that the configuration is relatively straightforward. Once you've configured both TestRail and your single sign-on identity provider with the required information, you'll be able to test out your connection and start streamlining your user management and authentication processes. So all I've done there is extract the information out of, in this case, Okta, and plugged it into the single sign-on tab inside of TestRail. So there's a few fields that need to be configured: the SSO URL, the issuer URL, and we need a certificate as well. But once you've got all of that, you can just test your connection, and if all of the settings are correct, it should work pretty much out of the box. So when you get to the my slides are slightly out of sync here. Okay, so if you need further instructions on setting up single sign-on, then integration can be the instructions can be found on our docs.gurok.com site, including examples for Okta and Azure. So I'm not going to run through a full implementation of those here. If you want to find out some more information about the specifics of those configurations, then you can just go to our site and take a look at the documentation. And once everything has been configured, you're also going to need to make sure that your users have been enabled for single sign-on authentication by going into their profiles and checking the enable single sign-on checkbox. And if you have lots of users, then you can utilize the bulk user edit feature that I demonstrated earlier in order to do this. So once single sign-on has been configured and enabled for your users, then they can log in using the configured single sign-on provider. Once again, Okta in the example that I'm showing you here. So I'm going into my user, enabling single sign-on authentication. And then I'm going to log out. And now my user can log in using the single sign-on button, logging into Okta in this case, which redirects me back into TestRail. If you still want your testers to be able to log in or fall back to their existing TestRail credentials, then you can do that by checking the authentication fallback checkbox on the single sign-on configuration tab in the administration console. And while you're there, you can also enable the ability to create accounts on first login by checking the appropriate box. Now, once new users are added to your identity provider, then so long as they've been granted access to TestRail as an application, then the first time they try to log into TestRail, their account will be automatically created for them. Okay, so with all of those users pottering around on your TestRail instance, it's important to be able to see what changes are being made, when, and by who. So in TestRail 5.7, we also introduced the new TestRail audit log feature for enterprise customers, providing you with exactly that. So as a TestRail enterprise customer, you'll be able to access the audit log via the TestRail administration console. If you happen to be an enterprise server customer, then in addition to being able to configure audit logging inside of TestRail itself, you can also write your audit logs to external files. to be read using whichever log reader you're most comfortable with. Once you've activated your audit log, you can configure it according to your preferences, setting the desired audit level, the maximum number of audit records stored, and the maximum number of days to store them for. You can also specify the maximum number of rows to display on the audit log page. Again, if you're an enterprise server customer, a TestRail enterprise server customer, you also have the option of setting custom maximum records and storage configurations, since it's your own infrastructure on which you're storing them rather than our cloud infrastructure. So I'm just going to go back to my slide that was a little bit out of order there. Okay, so once you get to the log tab itself, then you can see, depending on the level of your audit logging settings, so mine are set to high in this case, all of the updates, the creations, and the deletions for all of your TestRail assets, your projects, cases, test runs, milestones, etc., along with all of the information about what changes have been made, when, by who, and how, whether it was via the UI or the API. And if you want to apply a filter to the log, then you can do that quickly and easily using the handy filtering window. So you can see I'm filtering those by API. And you can filter and search those as needed. Okay, so going back to where I was. And if you want to export your logs for further analysis, then you can do that too. And once you've exported, you can open those up in your application of choice, Numbers in this case. All right, so I've gone through all of the user management features that I wanted to cover off in this webinar. So Jacob, do we have some questions?
Share it with you here. When a user is made inactive, does the last login time remain available to view, or is it reset? It will be, if the user is made inactive, it will stay there. You can always see when they last accessed the instance. If they are forgotten, that's going to change a little bit because you won't be able to see who the user was or anything. It'll still keep that last access date, but it'll give a lot more or a lot less details about who the user was. But if you are looking at just making a user inactive for a period of time, you will be able to still see when they were last active in the UI. The audit log is not available for cloud users. The audit log is available for cloud users. It is available on for the TestRail Enterprise system. So it's not going to be available for just a basic cloud account. But if you do want to upgrade to the TestRail Enterprise, then you will see the audit log option in the administration menu under site settings.
So just on that note, the quickest way to talk to us about upgrading to TestRail Enterprise, if that's something you're interested in, is probably going to be via the contact@gurok.com email address. Just ping us over an email and mention that you're interested in TestRail Enterprise, and we will be happy to have a conversation with you about that.
Okay, and a similar question, who has access to audit logs? That would be any administrator within a TestRail Enterprise system. So it does require going into the administration menu under site settings and administration is where you will actually be able to see and access the audit log. So it's not something that just any user would be able to see. That would have to be an administrative user in order to access that. Is there an option to export IP address of the machine together with username for auditing? Not currently. We don't track access IPs. So that's not something that is currently logged in this system, but that may be something we explore in a future update.
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing more about why that feature would be useful to you. Again, send us an email and ask us for it as a feature request.
Can an obfuscated user become active again? No, once a user is forgotten, that user account will be locked forever. There's not our system completely purges all of that information from within the system as part of the GDPR compliance. So there would be no way to revert that user account back to the original form, because we don't remember any, like we've stripped that user's name and email address completely from the system. There's no traces of that user left behind except for the obfuscated name and email address. But yeah, there is no way to kind of remember a user after they've been forgotten. You can create a new user account using the original email address and name for that user that you set them up with initially, but you wouldn't be able to restore it back to the old user.
What we need is one of those Men in Black pens, isn't it, to wipe the memory of that user from the administrator's brain as well.
Right. Yeah. So as soon as that user is forgotten in the system, it's that user is gone, and there's not going to be a way to restore that. Can I link users from Active Directory to TestRail and then assign the permissions to them? Yes, you can. Once so if you're setting up Active Directory within TestRail, and you have it kind of configured to create user accounts when a user is logging in initially from Active Directory. Once that user account is created, the administrator can go through and apply their own permissions to that user. So when that account is initially created, it's going to be set to the default user role and have all of the default permissions for the role that they're assigned. But you can go through and update that user's details and grant them additional or fewer permissions as necessary. If we are based in Canada, does the GDPR compliance affect us as well? It's not the legal scenarios that are kind of presented from GDPR are not, it doesn't really apply the same way that it does to any European Union users, but the basics of how the system works is going to be universal for everyone. So if a user kind of requests that you remove their data from your system, it's not something that's exactly like legally necessary for you to do, but you do have the option to use the GDPR compliant tools that we've created.
Yeah, we're not in control of the reach of the legislation, but you still get the same functionality.
How can we grant and revoke rights on multiple test suites of same project? So right now, the individual user permissions would be completely project-based. There wouldn't be a way to kind of separate those permissions out to individual test suites within a project. That's getting a little bit more granular than our user system currently offers. So I don't know that that's something that you'd be able to do within the system right now, but that might be something we look into later if we want to kind of further split things up. But right now, that's definitely not a priority for us. But if you'd like, you can email us at contact@gurock.com and kind of give us a little bit more info about what you're trying to do there, and we'll see if we can find a solution for you. Where is the audit log to save? On the local server or local PC? Are there options to save in the local PC? So the audit log, if you're using, or you can take this one, Simon.
If you're running TestRail server and wanting to export your audit logs to an external file, then the location for that file is managed within the config.php file in your TestRail installation. So you can just define where you want those audit logs to be stored yourself.
All right, and thank you to everybody who's asking questions. We were trying to keep up there. I know we got quite a few that popped in towards the end there. So if we missed your question, apologies for that. Sorry if we kind of skipped over, didn't mean to here, but if you do have any further questions, please reach out to us at contact@gurock.com. You can also reach out via the forums at discuss.gurock.com.
I've been Simon Knight. You can find me on the blog, on our TestRail site, and you can also find me on Twitter and LinkedIn and places. Also, thank you, Jacob Scott. So you can also find him on the TestRail forum, as Jacob mentioned, and you can contact the support team via contact@gurock.com. Thanks very much for being with us today. Please do stay in touch with us via the contact@gurock.com email, as I mentioned, and on the forums. Please also do consider signing up for our mailing list. Check out the regular blog posts on our blog.gurock.com site. Do check out the upcoming webinars on our TestRail site. There's a dedicated webinar page there. And if you want to join us on Facebook, you can do. Just search for TestRail on Facebook. All right, I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for joining. Thank you, Jacob, for answering questions, and we will see you at the next one. Bye-bye.